you have some myths here, some myths, I should say, that the Texans were able to debunk by going out there and drafting CJ Stroud with the second overall pick.
Yeah, we go back to the draft a couple of weeks ago, and obviously leading up to the draft, there was a lot of concern and worry that the Texans weren't going to draft a quarterback in the first round. Forget just at number 2, but there were people who thought, and a lot of reports out there that believed that the Texans were going to avoid drafting a quarterback during night 1 of the NFL draft. I mean, some of the Vegas odds just a couple of hours before the draft coverage started had Will Anderson as like a minus 350 favorite to be the number 2 pick. I mean, that was the strongest odds in favor of Will Anderson throughout the entirety of the pre-draft process, and it happened just hours before the Texans actually made their pick. Of course, by the time we got to the draft, CJ Stroud became the heavy favorite once people realized what was going on. But yeah, I mean, for a long time, it felt like the Texans were going to go defense and they were going to avoid taking a quarterback. Obviously, that was not the case. So, yeah, a couple of myths that a lot of people had talked about, and people use these as reasons for why the Texans were not going to take any quarterback, but especially CJ Stroud with that number 2 overall pick. The first one, and we talked about this a lot, Jake, DeMeco Ryans has a 6-year contract. So, hey, the Texans are comfortable losing a lot next year. Because DeMeco Ryans has a 6-year deal, because the Texans have just fired coaches in back-to-back years, and there's no way they're going to fire a third coach in as many years, that, hey, DeMeco Ryans can be comfortable not trying to win in 2023. And this is one for me, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too. I could never figure this one out because DeMeco Ryans turned down the chance to interview for other jobs in the past. He turned down the chance to interview for other jobs this offseason. He was waiting for the right gig, and the right gig is not one that requires you to tank for a year or 2 when you get there. And I think about DeMeco Ryans as a player and how competitive he was. I think about DeMeco Ryans as a coach and what he was doing, cheering and jumping up and down and hugging and loving on players like a maniac at times on the sideline in San Francisco. Like, that guy is competitive and passionate as all get out. I never thought there was a chance that DeMeco Ryans was going to be okay with not taking a quarterback because that means his team was going to suck. But a lot of people felt that way, and sure enough, that was debunked by the selection of CJ Stroud.
Completely agree. And to add to your point about DeMeco, I agree with everything you said there. How about the Caserio factor in all this? You think Nick Caserio could go another year where you're one of the worst teams in the league so he could get his quarterback? He's not going to be the GM making that pick if he allowed that to happen. So the idea the Texans were just going to pass on quarterback and they were just going to be bad on purpose, we never bought it. We said that maybe they don't go quarterback at 2, but we were banking on a quarterback at 12, or we talked about a trade-up scenario. So it never made any sense that, because DeMeco's got a 6-year deal, they're just going to stand pat and bypass quarterback altogether and go into next year with Case Keenum and Davis Mills as your top 2 QBs.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Caserio as well, right? Look, if CJ Stroud doesn't work out, Caserio's losing his job, but if the Texans were one of the worst teams in football over the next couple of years, Caserio was going to be gone anyway. So he's sort of going down swinging. He's at least trying to turn things around. And once again, I mean, we heard from Cal McNair earlier in the show. He said he didn't have any say on the draft picks, and that was all Caserio and DeMeco who called the final shots, which that part may be true, but I still harken back to that press conference that Caserio held right after he had fired Lovie Smith and just how it felt like we had a different version of Nick Caserio at the podium that day. Felt like there was maybe a stern talking to given by the McNair family that Caserio needed to start winning sooner rather than later, and I think he realized that as well. So that's the first myth, mainly DeMeco, but also Caserio is a good one too. It's like, DeMeco Ryans has a 6-year contract, so the Texans are comfortable losing a lot next year. They debunked that one. The S2 score. And this is one that I talked about a lot and one that I have questions about CJ Stroud for because, look, recent history is not on CJ Stroud's side when it comes to the S2 score. Now, the S2 hasn't been around for very long, and most people had no idea what this test was until like a month ago, but there has not been a quarterback score incredibly low on this test that have had a lot of success in the NFL. And CJ Stroud, according to some reports out there, had the lowest score of any of the quarterbacks who took this test. And one of the myths was, Nick Caserio, he's a smart guy, and he cares about that type of stuff, or at least you would assume he cares about that type of stuff. There's no way the Texans are going to draft a quarterback that scored that poorly on the S2 score. Jake, obviously, they debunked that myth because they took the guy who had the lowest test score in this class.
Because ultimately, I think when it came down to it, the film for CJ Stroud was better than the film for Anthony Richardson and Will Levis, and I think the Texans came to their senses and realized, look, the S2 score, it is what it is, but doesn't mean just because there hasn't been a quarterback that has been successful with a low score doesn't mean that you should bypass someone else who might be a worse talent just because they maybe scored better on a test.
CJ Stroud might be massively important for the S2. Mini sidebar here. Like, some thought his stock was going to plummet because of that S2 score. That's not the case. I mean, the Texans took him at 2. I think the Colts would have taken him at 4. We had the report about the Titans wanting to trade up to 3 if the Texans passed on him. So ultimately, all that scuttlebutt, CJ Stroud was still going to be one of the top picks and probably the second quarterback picked in this NFL draft. But Stroud's better than anybody who's bombed the S2 test. If he is awful in the league, heaven forbid, then maybe people carry a lot more weight with that test and put a lot more stock into it. But ultimately, it didn't matter. The Texans clearly didn't. They trusted the film. They trusted the tape. They trusted the conversations that they had with people about CJ Stroud, and that's what mattered more. So, yeah, that was another myth that was sort of debunked by the Texans' selection of CJ Stroud. And then the last one, Jake, I know you were all over this, and you were worried about this one. There's no way the Texans are going to take a David Mulligetta client. Everybody knows at this point that CJ Stroud, like Deshaun Watson, is represented by David Mulligetta. Caserio had talked about Mulligetta not being a factor, but there was still some worry because of the way the Deshaun Watson situation unfolded that, hey, maybe the Texans would try to shy away from something like that, but ultimately they were comfortable going with the Mulligetta guy.
Yeah, that was, to me, a real thing. You know, I had heard some rumblings from people that have given me information before that there was some bad blood, not necessarily between Nick Caserio and Deshaun's agent, David Mulligetta, but the McNair family in general didn't love the idea of having to pay Deshaun Watson $10 million to not play. Before they even had to do all that, Deshaun requested a trade, and then, got, accused of sexual misconduct by more than 20-plus women. And every time it was a story, it was Houston Texans quarterback Deshaun Watson, and I heard that they weren't happy with all that. So I wondered if that played a part at all, and I'm glad it didn't. And I said when we were doing the show leading up to the draft, it should not play a factor in your evaluation of C.J. Stroud, because ultimately, if C.J. Stroud you believe is the best available quarterback for you, that's more important than whoever the heck his agent is.
Yeah, I'm with you, man, and I'm glad it didn't play too much of a role here. And look, the Texans treated Deshaun Watson extremely well, and because of that, they treated David Mulligetta extremely well after the trade request, right? We've talked about it. We don't need to get into it. There were circumstances that we assume led to the Watson trade request. Unfortunately, he's never publicly talked about why he wanted out of here, but you can connect some dots and maybe come to an assumption for why that happened. But you think about it, after the trade request, the Texans treated Deshaun Watson and David Mulligetta better than any other team would, right? They paid him $10 million to not play for a year. They didn't air his dirty laundry that much. Then they let him negotiate with teams. Of course, he ultimately got to pick his final destination, if you call Cleveland a destination. The Texans were really nice.
It's a destination when they pay you $230 million.
Yeah, anywhere's a destination if they're paying you that type of coin. But yeah, like there's reason to believe. I'm with you. Like my thought was, if this was ever a thing, it wasn't going to be because Mulligetta's pissed at the Texans. It was going to be because the Texans were pissed at Mulligetta and mainly Deshaun Watson for that going down the way that it did. But ultimately, those two guys, I guess they were able to resolve something, or maybe there was nothing there to resolve in the first place. But yeah, all three of those myths basically debunked by Mythbusters, and more so by Nick Caserio and D'Amico Ryans by taking CJ Stroud, number 2, a couple of weeks ago.